Hello and welcome to Module 4 of Ombudsman Associate Certification Training. Module 4 discusses Ombudsman access. This module is just under 23 minutes long. There are 3 sections in today's presentation that we're going to go over. First, we're going to talk about an introduction to our Ombudsman advocacy visits. Next, we're going to talk about access to facilities, residents, and records. And finally, we're going to talk about consent and confidentiality. Today, our learning objectives will be to understand the protocols to follow during an advocacy visit, to know what rights you have to access facilities, residents, and their records, and to know the requirements and steps to obtaining consent. For Section 1, we're going to go over an introduction to Ombudsman advocacy visits. To begin, we're going to discuss what advocacy visits are and how to conduct an advocacy visit. You may hear Ombudsman use the term regular presence. Advocacy visits are one way that we achieve regular presence. We strive to conduct advocacy visits at least once each quarter to each provider in the region. Advocacy visits are the primary role for volunteers. The Ombudsman Enabling Law in the Ohio Revised Code defines an advocacy visit as a visit by a representative of the office to a long-term care provider, a resident, or a recipient when the purpose of the visit is to do one or more of the following: to establish a regular presence that creates awareness of the availability of the Office of the Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program, to increase awareness of the services the office provides, to address any other matter not related to the representative's investigation of a specific complaint. An advocacy visit may unexpectedly involve addressing uncomplicated complaints or lead to an investigation of a complaint when needed. This is why your role as volunteers is so crucial to the work of the office. Before we walk through each of the steps you need to take before you conduct an advocacy visit, what to do during an advocacy visit, and what to do after you've completed the advocacy visit. So before you do an advocacy visit, be sure that you're informed about the provider, particularly if we don't visit there regularly. If you need help reviewing any information, contact your volunteer coordinator. Some things you may want to research or to ask your volunteer coordinator to help research are to review any ODH survey reports, to see when their last annual review was conducted, and to review any complaints. This will give you a good history of how the provider has performed recently and may give you some ideas of areas you should focus on during your advocacy visit. Keep in mind that as advocates, we approach our visit differently, and regulators have the specific job of determining whether a regulation has been violated. We can also look at the resident and family satisfaction scores, which can be found on the Long-Term Care Consumer Guide website. Reviewing the scores will give you a sense of the experiences of residents and what to be on the lookout for when you're making observations during the advocacy visit. You can ask us if there are any regional complaints that we've received about the provider. Reviewing the complaints is helpful so you can see if those specific issues are still present or not. Also, you can ask if there has been non-complaint activity related to the provider, such as providing assistance and information or staff in-service education. Before you go, you can always check to see if the facility has any residents testing positive for COVID. Before you leave, check with us to make sure you have the most recent version of any handouts you're going to pass out to residents or staff. We will go with you on your first advocacy visit, and in a future field assignment, a volunteer or ombudsman specialist will go with you to help you feel comfortable. Once you have gathered all the necessary information for your visit, you're ready to conduct the visit. Upon arrival to the home, you'll do the following. You will sign in as an ombudsman and that you're there to visit residents. You don't want to identify any specific resident in the visitor log. Not only is confidentiality a key component in our work, but also we're not just visiting one resident during our visit. We're there to talk to several residents and make observations. Simply writing the word residents is all that is necessary. Have your state-issued ID card or certification letter with you. You do not need to wear the ID as a badge because it could be intimidating and make you look like an inspector. Ask if there are new residents living in the home. You can request this information and a list of names from the person at the front desk, the administrator, or anyone else we recommend. Let this staff person know you are an ombudsman volunteer and you're seeking a list of residents who have moved in since you visited last or in the past month. The purpose of having this information is to visit with those residents, to talk with them about their experiences since moving in, to educate the residents about the Ombudsman program, give them Ombudsman program brochures, including our phone number, and ask if they have any concerns they wish to share. This is an opportunity to build rapport with the new residents and ensure they know about their resident rights and can contact the Ombudsman program anytime. Finally, you may want to request a copy of the most recent Resident Council meeting minutes as appropriate. It is always best to talk with the Resident Council President about the minutes first. If the Ombudsman Specialist specifically told you to request a copy, you can ask the Social Services Director, Front Desk, or Activities Director, or whoever else the Ombudsman Specialist recommends. If the specialist didn't request you to review the Resident Council meetings, but you determine after you talk to a few residents that there are issues the Resident Council might have addressed, feel free to request a copy. Make sure you attach the copy in your volunteer report, which we'll discuss later. So once you've signed in, you're ready to talk with residents and begin your advocacy visit. During the visit, you'll do the following. You'll use sensory observations as soon as you arrive. What do you see? What do you smell? What are you hearing? Do you feel anything? For example, is the temperature too hot or too cold? Remember to note anything that doesn't seem right to you. We'll review reporting requirements in a little bit. What are the staff to resident and staff to staff interactions like? Are staff using person-centered approaches? Do they talk to residents with respect or treat residents with dignity? Does there appear to be a philosophy of care? Use the answers to these questions to guide your visit. When you talk with residents, ask them things like, how do you feel when staff interact with you? If you saw a resident upset after an aide was in their room, you may want to dig a little deeper and find out what happened. What is the resident comfort like? Are they comfortable in bed or in a chair? If they are in bed, is it by choice? Are they getting out of bed as desired? Do residents have access to water? Are rooms personalized? Like we mentioned on the previous slide, spend time meeting with new residents and introduce them to the Ombudsman program and resident rights. Let them know how to contact the Ombudsman program, talk with them, and see how the staff is helping them get acquainted with the home. Ask them if there is anything they need to help improve the quality of their care and their quality of life. If you do visit during mealtime, walk into the dining room and observe whether residents are being served the meal timely. Does the food look appetizing? Is hot food hot and cold food cold? Are residents talking with one another, or is the TV on way too loud in the background? Talk with a few residents and ask how their meal tastes and if they're satisfied with their meals in general. Are substitutions offered? How long does it take staff to assist those who need help with eating? Remember to be relaxed. Communicate with residents at eye level. Build rapport. Speak clearly and explain your role. Ask open-ended questions and be a good listener. Get to know the staff so you'll learn who will be helpful in resolving problems. Help residents expect excellence and encourage them to come to the Ombudsman with any issues or concerns. A quality advocacy visit can usually take an hour. Remember that the goal of an advocacy visit is to let residents know you care and that you want to help. After every advocacy visit, you'll need to send a report to your volunteer coordinator about your visit. We'll review the specific steps for completing and submitting volunteer reports in Module 9. You'll always want to include the resident's voice in your report. What did you ask them about, and what did they tell you? Did you provide any information to residents or staff? Make sure you identify residents and staff by name in your report. The next slide will review specific instructions for completing and submitting reports. If you identify a complaint during your advocacy visit, please let your volunteer coordinator or the assigned ombudsman know. This is important to ensure that when residents talk with an ombudsman about a problem, they know they'll get help from there, and there will be follow-up. Sometimes we see rather serious complaints, like ones involving abuse, in volunteer reports. When you learn of something that requires quick follow-up, like poor care, go ahead and call your volunteer coordinator or assigned ombudsman and talk with them about it right away, so the resident gets timely assistance from us. Be sure to always talk to your volunteer coordinator if you have questions. Also, you can reference the Quality Advocacy Visit tip sheet if needed. It's a resource we created to provide ombudsmen with best practices related to advocacy visits. Your regional ombudsman program can provide you with that tip sheet. Moving on to Section 2, we'll talk about access to facilities, residents, and records. As a representative of the Office of the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman, you have a right to access a home and its residents at reasonable times and at any other time when access to the home and its residents may be required by the circumstances to be investigated. As a representative of this office, you have unescorted access and can talk with anyone. In addition to having access, as a representative of the office, you have the right to private communication with residents and their sponsors. This means you are able to talk with a resident or their sponsor without any staff present. You have the right to talk with a resident with the door closed if necessary. However, if the resident gives you consent to have a staff member present, then that's their choice. We'll go more in depth about consent later in the presentation. No long-term care provider or other entity, person employed by a long-term care provider or other entity, shall deny you the right to access the home or residence, or deny you the right to private communication. This would be considered willful interference. If this happens, tell the staff person you are acting within the rights of the Office of the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman and that you have authority to access the home and residence. If the staff member is persistent and does not allow you to complete your tasks, ask for their name and just leave the home. Contact your volunteer coordinator or assigned ombudsman specialist right away and let them know when you were at the home, what you were attempting to do, and the name of the staff person. In Region 9, we do not have these experiences with homes. They know the Ombudsman program due to our consistent visits at the facility, so we haven't had problems with willful interference at all. As a representative of the office, you have access to provider records. This includes the provider's policies and procedures. Examples of these may include dietary records, staffing schedules, or grievance committee minutes. If you're working with an ombudsman specialist and they ask you to view the shower schedule, you would be able to request this information. Or if you received a complaint about missing items, you could request the provider's policy on how they handle this issue. If the provider gives you a copy, make sure you attach it with your volunteer report. Incident reports are a provider record. An incident is the occurrence of a violation with respect to a resident or recipient. The only time you would request to look at an incident report is when the assigned Ombudsman specialist asks you to review the incident report. You have the right to access a resident's family and representative's contact information. If a resident doesn't have capacity and you need to contact their family member or representative to obtain consent, you may ask the provider for the name and phone number of the resident's family members. Or, if you were contacting families about a family council issue, you could request their contact information. To wrap up this module, we're going to move on to Section 3 and talk about consent and confidentiality in Ombudsman practice. So now that you understand how to conduct an advocacy visit, we need to review consent. Obtaining consent is an important way to stay resident-focused. You must obtain consent to reveal the identity of complainants and residents. For example, if a resident's daughter tells you about an issue, she is your complainant. We need the daughter's consent to share her identity with anyone. We also need the resident's consent to share their identity. Only if a resident does not have capacity can we act on consent from the resident's legal representative or a resident sponsor, like a family member who's actively engaged in the resident's care. Capacity is an important component of this conversation. Capacity is not the same thing as competency. Capacity is a judgment call you make after talking with a resident. It's a non-clinical evaluation of whether a resident understands what you are asking and the context for your request. After you've talked with the resident for a few minutes, you should be able to determine whether that resident has capacity. Never assume consent just because a resident is telling you something they want changed. You must ask if you have consent and get a signed consent form, preferably, before proceeding. However, if you cannot obtain written consent, you may also obtain verbal consent from the resident. For example, if you're not able to conduct an in-person visit and you call a resident, you might ask if the resident is giving consent over the phone. Be sure to note consent was provided over the phone and also note the date consent was given. Someone might not want to give you consent because they don't want to be labeled as someone who complains, or they might fear retaliation. That's their choice. Even if a resident doesn't want to reveal their identity, it does not mean an investigation and a case cannot be opened. It's possible that the issues one resident has with call light response times, for example, are concerns of other residents too. It's important to remember that if a resident wishes to have their name remain confidential, that we respect their wishes. Now we'll talk about ways to ensure we don't disclose the information about a resident to staff. Before we move on to the next slide, as a heads up, in Module 9, we'll go over how to document consent on our consent form. So if we don't have consent, if the resident does not give you consent to reveal their identity or act, you still have a complaint that can be investigated. You can ask other residents what they're experiencing in relation to this issue. For example, you could ask other residents if they too are experiencing issues with getting their medications late or not having their linens changed often enough. Ombudsmen can be complainants if we do observe a problem. So, forms of disclosure. Confidentiality must be adhered to. If you have consent to reveal the resident's name, you don't need to conceal their information. However, if you don't, keep these things in mind when discussing confidential information. Obviously, you don't want to say the resident's name out loud to a staff member. Instead, you could say, I've been talking to a resident who has expressed concerns about responses to call light. Be mindful not to use gender-specific pronouns either. Saying their concern is, or this resident's concern is, will ensure you don't accidentally identify the resident. Also, referring to the client in a way that identifies them is disclosure, like revealing that they use oxygen, for example. If you're taking notes while talking to a resident, don't write their name down in a place where staff members can easily see it. When visiting with a resident who wants to remain confidential, don't just visit that one resident. Visit with several residents. This way, a staff member won't be able to determine who your client is. Nodding in agreement could also be perceived as disclosure. If a staff member says they think the concern is coming from Sam in room 202 and you nod, you would be disclosing their name. Lastly, just because a provider may presume the identity of your client does not allow you to confirm their presumption. It may be helpful to practice talking about this with your volunteer coordinator. Finally, let's review confidentiality. What does confidentiality mean to you? What does it mean to you personally? And what does it mean to you professionally? We all desire some confidentiality in our lives. A current example of this discussion is with Facebook and other social media websites. We want to share certain things about ourselves, but not with everyone. And we want to trust that what we have shared is kept confidential. This trust is important to the consumers that we serve. Strict confidentiality requirements are an important assurance we offer our clients who are sometimes afraid to share information about the caregivers whom they rely on heavily. There's a certain amount of privacy with consumers. We gather financial information, health and lifestyle information, knowledge of their inner family dynamics. We're getting this information so that we can best serve them by advocating for their choices, needs, and preferences. But the consumer has the right to privacy and trust that we will hold the information in confidence. We should only ask for information that we need to advocate for them. Respecting that confidence applies both within and outside of the agency. Just as we might not share every intimate detail of our lives with all our family members, the consumer's information needs to stay limited as well. There is a self-study associated with this module. This is about building rapport during advocacy visits. There is a short video, and then you'll answer questions on the worksheet. That's it for Module 4. Thanks for watching.